Well, I'm back with another guest. This is a fellow we used to have on all the time on the radio program. He'd call in with his thoughts on the news. He is a professor at Kentucky State University, and he is also, he told me, a trained lawyer. So we're going to get him to weigh in on the legal ramifications of Trump's uh, endless indictments and convictions. And I mean, it's just amazing. We have Professor Wilfred Reilly with us. How you doing, sir?
Doing great. Glad to be here.
How's Kentucky doing?
Kentucky's doing pretty well. One of the solid kind of backbone states there. I mean, not a lot going on really. The Derby, the annual kind of party season is winding down a little bit. So I mean, I'm just enjoying relaxing during the summer break right now.
Do you do the Derby scene?
Not immensely. I go to a couple of the events. I could probably get a box if I wanted to, but I don't. My fiance's birthday is right around that time, so I don't really spend like a week drinking and betting on horse races or anything like that.
Yeah.
I also, I mean, like I used to play basketball pretty frequently, sometimes competitively. I golf occasionally, but I don't bet on sports I don't really understand. So when people say, the number 6 horse looks like he's trailing leg a little bit, I might want to put $100 on him. It's like I have no idea what you're talking about. So I'm not a huge investor into that market, but I like Kentucky. I mean, the state's known for a range of things. I mean, kind of that urban rural contrast. I mean, Louisville's a top 25 or so U.S. city, but you've also got the Appalachian Highlands, horse racing, bourbon. Something like half of all American bourbon whiskey is made in Kentucky. So there are a huge number of little bars and distilleries scattered around the state. There are bourbon tours that come down from Cincinnati and from Chicago. So I enjoy the region. It's very, very pleasant.
You get to
I
hang
mean,
out
where I
with
live is kind of like last Kentucky thing, but I mean, I live there, Louisville, Lexington, Frankfort, which is our capital, and Cincinnati are all within an hour's driving distance of each other. So I mean, and these are all just normal sized cities. Frankfurt's the smallest with a daytime population probably of 100 or 200,000. I mean, the state workers all live here or work here at least. So I mean, like where I live is pretty mundane. Like there's not any cool like Appalachian stuff going on, like people playing gut fiddles in the street or anything. It's just like I mean, I live in a subdivision. So the
yeah.
the the ability to leave that area and go check out the rest of the state and hunt or fish or something is pretty cool. But the actual like the Cincinnati suburbs or something just look like any place else. So America is becoming a little more homogenized for good and ill. I'm sure you guys in the radio business see that a lot.
Yeah.
Where every station is owned by what is it, Clear Channel or whatever,
Yeah.
iHeart. I mean, every newspaper is owned by Gannett. So there
All the
there are
talk
elements of
radio
that
hosts,
and of
all
unique
the talk
regionalism.
all the talk radio hosts are owned by the same people, so it's all the same. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I assume the hosts are all original individuals, but I mean, like it is pretty crazy. Like when you look at media across local markets, like I mean, I drove across the country a lot when I was a sales guy, and I mean, now you do it to speak and so on, and it is a little bizarre when you go across 15 markets, like 15 county-sized districts, and it's all the same on the radio. It's like, welcome to live hip hop here in Dubuque, Iowa, and it's
Yeah.
like that. I mean, there is a force behind that.
Yeah. What do you think? You said you're a basketball fan. What do you think of the deal going on with this girl that's making all everybody upset? Caitlin Clark, WNBA player. She's supposed to be the star player, but they're just so mad that she's succeeding. And there's a video of young girls taking a photo with her, and they're just making the WNBA people seethe with wrath. Have you seen this?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple things about that. Like, first of all, I'm sure that there's a race and class element to that. I mean, Caitlin Clark is a skinny, I mean, although they're all like 6'3", but white woman from Iowa. She's got the biggest WNBA contract this year for like, 100,000 or whatever it is. And I'm sure there's some irritation from the other players on the court about that. And that's never cool. But I mean, there are also a couple other elements to this. First of all, like if you're a overhyped rookie in any sport, the idea that people are going to hit you and knock you to the court isn't exactly radical. So I would say to the extent 25% or whatever that stuff is racial or class based, that's lame. But I mean, there's an entire book called The Jordan Rules, which describes, Mike Jordan, and at the time also, I mean, Larry Bird had been there for a few years, Magic Johnson. This is pre-HIV, so they were pretty brutal with him. They describe these very hyped rookies. I don't think you can describe any of them as overhyped, those three. But coming into the league, and the policy was like, if you drive to the hoop, we're not going to let you score on, Joe Dumars or Larry Johnson or whoever. So we're going to hack you over the shoulders. We're going to crip you. We're going to kick you in the nuts. I mean, it's this type of aggressive defense that the NBA was then known for, and the WNBA is maybe doing a 15th of that. So it's hard as someone who played competitive sports and as someone who's read the Jordan rules and so on, and as someone who remembers those fights in the 90s in the NBA and the NFL. I mean, people got punched out. Who
Yeah.
is it? Like Rudy Tomjanovich and like Kermit Watson or someone got in a fight, and Tomjanovich got punched in the head and almost died.
Yeah.
I mean, that sort of thing was fairly common. So I mean, it's a sign of the increasing sensitivity in society, I think, as well as the increasing racial tension in society. And another point also, like if it weren't for the like, there's some racial hostility and this player, someone that is attractive to many people and so on. I don't think anyone would be following this story. Like I don't think there are a lot of people that are watching the WNBA even
No,
after
no.
Caitlin Clark has joined the roster.
Yeah, I don't think so. I never heard of it. Uh, but I just wanted to get your take on it because I've heard a lot of people are really all fired up about this nonsense. I
Other than
want to,
people that are like pretty white girl and pretty black girl get in fight, I'm gonna pick a team. Like I don't think most
yeah,
of these bros talking about this could name what team Caitlin Clark
right.
plays for. I'm not sure I could myself.
I don't know either. Yeah, I don't know what it is.
Yeah, nobody's there. There is not a large male former athlete audience for the
Yeah, I
WNBA.
thought
I'm
the
putting this as politely
WNBA
as
was an
possible.
NGO that engineers democracies around the world. I didn't know it was a. I'm just joking. But, yeah, um, I wanted to also get you. You said you're a vicious attorney in your former life, or did you ever practice law, or what was your?
Well, yeah. Just to clarify, I'm not a practicing attorney.
Okay,
I trained as a lawyer. I went to the University of Illinois College of Law and did reasonably well. I graduated in 2005. I have a law degree. I mean, there's no particular reason I couldn't take the Kentucky bar and practice. I think I'd clear it pretty easily. Um, yeah, I'm not a practicing lawyer,
okay,
certainly not in Kentucky, basically just because I went to grad school immediately afterwards. So there's no like disastrous story of failure. I gave up on the old
right,
profession or something. I just when I was in law school, my final year, I was very young. I mean, I was like 22 the year I graduated from law school because I mean I was promoted a couple of grades ahead in grade school or whatever just because I mean, and this actually probably affected me as an athlete and socially and so on. I mean, like I enjoyed the experience, but I could have had a couple more years in like Aurora and Chicago public schools. I'm not sure I'd have necessarily wanted to, but I mean, because of that, I was 17 maybe when I got out of high school, and when I got into law school, I couldn't drink. I was 20. I remember that. So when I got out, I was 22, and the jobs I was applying for were things like my interest was white collar criminal prosecution. So they were very serious. And I'd also applied to a couple grad schools and was like, I could chill and work on my frisbee skills for a while and talk to girls. Like, there's no real reason I have to rush into a large firm or a big city prosecutor's office. And I was pretty immature at this time, as I'm sure my classmates would tell you. Like, one of the summers, I mean, I had done some legal work. And I think that's the summer I worked for Habitat for Humanity. It was pretty high level. But I mean, at the same time, when I came home, I had like managed a store or something for like 3 weeks just to make money before going back to law school. So there'd be a pretty sharp transition between that and working for like the government of Michigan or something. So I ended up going back to Southern Illinois University and going for the PhD. And I ended up getting the PhD, which takes a long time. I mean, this is like 8 years later because I mean, I wanted to publish while I was in grad school and so on down the line. But I came out with the degree and ended up just basically teaching.
yeah. So, as uh, someone with that kind of background, what do you think of this series of convictions that Trump has just had?
I mean, I think it's complete bullshit. Like, I'm still pretty good with the law. I'm familiar with the
Yeah,
basic structure of the state and federal system. I'm familiar with the statute of limitations question in the case and so on. Yeah, my opinion on the case is that, and I might confuse the state and federal levels here, but because I don't have the notes in front of me, but basically, what you're talking about here is something that would normally be a federal level misdemeanor crime. It's basically a campaign finance violation. It is a falsification of business records allegation. Falsification, FBR is not always even illegal, by the way. I mean, if you have a privately held corporation, it's not always against the law as long as you don't report this to the IRS to have two sets of books. I mean, that's a complex accounting question we don't need to get into here. But if you're just talking about this kind of FBR stuff, my understanding would be that there is no crime at all because the statute of limitations expired so long ago. I mean, we're talking about a 2016 case. Statute of limitations on most criminal offenses is 5 years max. I mean, we're talking about felonies for that.
Right.
So to charge a crime here at all, Alvin Bragg, the prosecutor, had to convert this misdemeanor at one level of the justice system into more than one felony for technical reasons at another level of the justice system. And the way he did that was by saying that crime A was in service of another crime that he called crime B and or crime C. The problem with this is that, and I kind of wonder if I'm missing something here because that's so crazy, but he doesn't seem to have ever identified what that crime was. His prosecutors have spelled out at least two possible options for that crime, instructing the jury. So what he's saying is like this thing that happened 10 years ago now, or 8 years ago, is still technically chargeable because it was done to assist something else. And again, that's very questionable. That's very debatable, but that's his argument. And then the charging, like they didn't just charge one crime here. They charged whatever is 34 crimes. The way they got to that was to take an initial transaction. The argument here is basically that Trump paid off his side girl to the tune of about $100,000 to keep her mouth shut during his legal or his run for president. But what they did was take like each payment to
And they don't have any
Daniels.
evidence that that was his side girl, anyways. It could have just been a freak. You know what I mean? They don't have any evidence of that. So,
Yeah, I mean, well, it doesn't really matter. I mean, like
yeah.
the argument, the fact that they slept together is pretty well attested. I mean, Daniels has testified to this in open, perjury liable court. Daniels has offered to take a polygraph test. Trump has apparently bragged about this. So, I mean, I don't think that
I
there's
think he's.
any.
I think he's refused. I think he's denied having anything to do with her. But
Later and as he moved toward running as a Christian Republican. I mean, he said it didn't happen. But I mean, like I think there's really obviously Trump would simply have sued Daniels for slander if this hadn't happened. Like if there was evidence, like if he were somewhere else that day, he were with his wife or another woman. I mean, like if there was any plausible alibi,
Well,
Trump would
why didn't he
simply
sue
have
that other lady with the weird cat? Uh,
Eugene Carroll.
yeah,
I mean, an obvious answer would be because that happened too. I mean,
you
like
think so?
the question in that case, it's always awkward as a guy to speculate about this. I'll just say the question in that case would be whether that was a rape. So what had to be proven in that case was whether Trump raped E. Jean Carroll. Trump has very consistently said he didn't rape E. Jean Carroll. And in fact, he did go up to defend himself really aggressively in that case against the rape allegation. Trump has never denied that they were messing around in a department store. So I mean, I think that
No, I
probably
think
happened.
he said I've never met her. I don't know how she thinks that could have happened or whatever. She said
No,
I
I
only
mean,
saw her
I
one
don't know.
time
He
in a
he definitely didn't
handshake.
say that in court. That
Yeah,
the thing that I would watch with Trump is what is his testimony on those rare occasions when he's been in court, taken the stand or submitted papers. You can say anything to the press.
yeah.
Um, so and this is very important. I don't think too many people seriously believe that Trump never had sex with women other than his wife. Like, I think on the right, there's a desire to have sort of moral candidates. And so when Trump says, I didn't do it, people are sometimes like, well, who'd believe these whores? With the Stormy Daniels thing, Stormy Daniels describes going to a hotel where Trump was at a time when Trump was there. and describes pretty explicitly. And like the first time she described it, made it sound pretty enjoyable. She's now moving back toward this feminist, like, I barely knew why I was there, naked in a man's hotel room. But I mean, like, she describes a normal male dominant, like he was on top. We moved a couple positions. I don't think I came, but he did. I slapped him with the magazine. We hung out a couple times later. He offered me a job. Just a normal sexual experience, and then they moved on. The odds that didn't happen are really, really low, man. I mean, just Trump himself has frequently gone on the record and said things like, dating was my Vietnam. I was out there chasing women. Women have come forward and said, he's one of my best lovers. Marla Maples said that he was a good big guy overall.
Yeah, no one's disputing that he has he was very active womanizer. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to belabor the point because it's just a side point to me, but I thought he had always denied having relationships with both of those women, but that doesn't mean it's not true.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's an interesting point. I mean, I think that E. Jean Carroll, I don't think Trump has in any formal way denied interacting with. I think he's denied that there was any rape or coercion. I'm sure off the record, like to the press, he said, "Yeah, I don't know that bitch." But I mean, like the E. Jean Carroll case, E. Jean Carroll actually is an interesting person mentally. Like if you've ever seen like the filming of E. Jean Carroll's estate, where there's like graffiti over trees and like cats running around and so on. She's testified in public that and this is not me trying to be funny as like a male panelist here. I mean, she said things like rape is very sexy, isn't it? When being interviewed by like feminist TV anchors, and like the show has been stopped for this reason. So the question kind of is not like, did these people once hook up, but like, are we confident enough in this person's memory from 30 years ago when these people were both in the New York party scene, that they had sex at all, but B, that this is a forcible rape? That she thought of it in those terms during like the swinging 1980s or whatever, and has been repressing this for 30 years. And interestingly, by the way, the jury didn't think so. The jury found Trump liable for some kind of sexual assault, but they did not. The label they put on Trump was not rapist, as I recall. That was not something that they concluded. That was actually a weird case. Like they concluded that Trump was liable for something, but it wasn't rape. And again, that's one of those cases where like the civil non-criminal liability they found in that case was like $30 million. So all these cases are intentionally being held in very unfriendly blue city locations where you're going to get that result. But anyway, to get back to just the legal thing with the Stormy Daniels case, because at some level, like if a guy cheats on his wife once, I mean, his wife slaps him. It's not necessary. That's not illegal. The thing about the Stormy Daniels case is that what happened was that a series of these kind of picayune bookkeeping errors were what became the 34 felonies. So who is it in this case? Cohen? It wasn't Comey. It was Mike Cohen, right?
Yeah, Michael Cohen.
Michael Cohen, yeah. So Trump, in order to pay off Stormy Daniels, allegedly, and you can't believe this guy either. I mean, all these people in this case are complete scumbags, including Daniels to some extent. I mean, but so Trump, to pay off Daniels, allegedly had Michael Cohen transfer these monies to her. And then he's paying back Michael Cohen with a series of checks. So what the felonies are one, checks written to Michael Cohen. Then two, like literally notifications of those checks being made, usually under a different name, in an office software like QuickBooks. And then references to those checks or to those financial transactions being made during things like internet uploads of QuickBooks documents. That's actually what it was. I was gonna say that last one might be a little off, but that's straight down the line. So if you have like 10 checks, you have crime 1, crime 2, crime 3. So you go from this one thing where a guy slips a check into this sex worker's, let's say, purse, to like 35 felonies because in QuickBooks we counted that check as a bunch of different things. So when you say he was convicted of 35 things, that's all that means. That was the point there.
Wow. So it's just one check and 34 different entries on QuickBooks?
So there was some similar software. Yeah, it's just bullshit. I mean, it's like, no, Trump didn't shoot 34 puppies. It was, they wrote, the porn star he was occasionally hooking up with, maybe, they wrote her one check He paid back his lawyer using a pretty standard technique, and because he recorded it, the and again, like, you have to accept his lawyer's word that those checks were for that. Like, the case was, I think it is very, very, very probable, as I just explained in detail, that Trump slept with Daniels and like his lawyer was probably his bag man and so on. But again, even whether that was proved beyond a reasonable doubt, I mean, I'm not familiar with every step of the case, but I would assume outside of Manhattan, you would have had to demonstrate that with some degree of skill. But yeah, like, if you accept that those checks are for that purpose, that's what the 33 felonies were. One of them was like something else, like, and I don't know, maybe they entered the check twice or something. Ben Shapiro gave a pretty good explanation of what that one was.
Um, why do you think that he seems to get more support the more he gets persecuted? So he gets impeached again, he gets stripped off of the internet, and it kind of leads to the occasion by which Musk buys Twitter, and all of a sudden his type of viewpoints are more easily seen in the mainstream again. Everything they do to persecute him seems to backfire with more peeling off more moderate and otherwise independent supporters going towards him. Now that he's been convicted, I mean, first the mugshot was a big one too. Remember, he got a big support for that. There was videos of people in the inner city hood of Atlanta cheering him on like he was their, ghetto Bruce Wayne, going down the street saying, "Here come Trump, here come Trump," saying, they told him to show up, and he's done shown up. He's showing up, and they were so excited for him to do that. At least in some of those videos that people were seeing, and now that he's been convicted, he's getting even more crossover support. Gen Z females are actually thinking about a few of them are swinging a little bit over in that direction, and that may be is that a phenomenon because a lot of those notorious criminals get a lot of fangirl letters. I just thought about that. So,
No, I mean, that is pretty funny. Like, I mean, someone, maybe it's Charles Manson, said all you have to do to get girls contacting you every day is kill somebody. But I mean, no,
hey,
I think with Trump, there's a more serious level to this. Like, I mean, I'm almost certainly voting for Trump now. And like, I mean, my opinion on Trump and Biden was for a long time. I mean, both these guys are almost 80 years old and lie pretty frequently. I don't know. I might vote for Abraham Lincoln if I get a ballot with one of those Kentucky signature lines on it. But no, I mean, like, after the like 34 felonies, I mean, I think a lot of people feel that Trump's political opponents set him up for a series of show trials, and they're pissed off about that.
yeah,
So, like, the thing with Trump, I mean, Trump just kind of is who he is. Like, he's this big, flamboyant New Yorker who talks a lot of shit. He said a lot of stuff you're not, quote unquote, supposed to say as president. Some of it probably did cross some lines. I mean, I don't think that Trump has demonstrated not just, attempts to change election law to benefit the Democrats. That happened. But like actual people stuffing enough ballot boxes to take the election away from him. I mean, so Trump's out there saying a bunch of stuff political candidates normally don't say. That's real. He's very much the guy who used to host The Apprentice. That's real. At the same time, it's also real that the Democrats have been doing stuff that's at least as crazy against Donald Trump since he started campaigning for office. And
yeah,
we kind of forget this, but like the whole Russia thing was a hoax.
right,
Like, remember that for years there was this idea that Donald Trump was he was a Russian agent. People were on TV saying things like asset or even agent. He and Putin were supposed to have each other's cell phone numbers. There was what is it? Trump rented an upper end Russian hotel and had prostitutes urinate on the bed Obama sometimes slept in. Like, just did crazy stuff. There was a whole Steele dossier, which turned out to be, of course, purchased by the Hillary Clinton campaign from this sketchy firm, Fusion GPS. By the way, illegally using campaign funds.
right,
Hillary Clinton admitted to a crime that's about as serious as what Trump did. But the only thing that was ever discussed in terms of potential prosecution was one count. And she got out of that by paying a fine of, I think, $123,900. But I mean, just all this Russiagate, Fusion GPS, Steele dossier, these legendary names. This goes back to the beginning with Trump. They actually wiretapped Trump Tower. Everyone thought, even on the right, we thought that was a joke about the feds. Like, yeah, they're going to wiretap you, bro. No, they actually did. They had the bugs in the bathrooms and shit. This is just going on and on and on and on. And it's created, I think, what we'd say is a reciprocal cycle where Trump has become more aggressive and paranoid. And he said things like, they're out to get me. They're
Yeah.
coming to get me. So, the back and forth is what it was. And after the election, it's continued. Trump was impeached twice. I'm kind of rambling here, but that's why people support Trump. The idea is we have two corrupt political factions, but one's worse. And the one that's at least slightly worse is trying to bring down the preferred candidate of the people. That's what a lot of people believe. Like, the last thing, but there are two ways to look at the current situation in America. One is to take the perspective that you're supposed to have if you live in Chicago or New York or San Francisco, or for that matter, Louisville, which is kind of like there's a repressive, evil core population in this country, and they want to turn back all the change we've made. They want to get rid of the ideal level of tolerance for gay Americans that we have today. They want to take our beautiful feminists and put them back in marriages. They want to stop the immigration of abused refugees that we must continue, et cetera, et cetera. These people are terrorists. And the other way to look at this is we've been doing a lot of crazy things recently while describing a huge chunk of the country's core legacy population, white Americans, conservative Black Americans, women in normal marriages, et cetera, as dangerous or evil. And many of the things I just described, like unlimited low merit immigration, are things almost no one supports. So when someone comes up and speaks out about that, maybe it's not actually the case that they're a terrorist dictator. Maybe we should consider voting for that guy. So a lot of people, whatever they might say in public, kind of have that in the right brain, and they're going to very likely go to the polls and vote for Big Orange.
I want to get to your upcoming book by HarperCollins called Lies Your Liberal Teacher Told You, which is coming out on June 11th this month. You're going to run through in this book some of the big myths you were talking, because you kind of set the stage for that with that statement that there's been this narrative that these evil people are trying to roll everything back in reality. A lot of that's based on these kind of mythic narratives that have become dominant tropes of the leftist hegemony that we live under. So you, as a college professor, are taking on some of these classic myths and kind of a homage to the original 1995 James Lowen book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, which was a left-leaning book that was probably criticizing some of the myths of praising the founding fathers too much, that kind of stuff. What was he taking on?
James Lowen, and by the way, it looks like my computer might die. If it does, I'll just come back on in a minute or two on a different computer. But James Lowen, I mean, his book, obviously, he's writing from the left. I mean, pretty far to the left, in my opinion. But his book isn't just, commie nonsense. He does point out that there's what people have sometimes called jingoistic education in the USA that really did go on for a while, where, I mean, there were people were taught things like there were almost no civilized Native Americans in North America. Like the Europeans arrived and they just kind of walked through to the West Coast through a couple bone in the nose savages, and so there was no real discussion of, say, the Cahokians or the Anasazi or whatever. They get into the Plains Indians because those people could fight well enough that they were hard to ignore. And you had to kill them first to settle down, is the general narrative, which is not entirely wrong. But I mean, so he makes that point, and he does talk about slavery and that kind of thing. But I mean, and it's worth. I mean, if you want to read the book on the left side, go buy it, audience. But I mean, he does make some interesting points. But I think that there's something that I got tired of listening to over about the past 20 years in high school and college, than higher ed, more higher ed. And I think the usual narrative kind of takes two prongs. Like, one is the USA and the West, or the white world, or whatever term you want to use, is the worst society ever to exist.
Yeah.
We had slaves, and we killed indigenous people, and we used to mistreat women, and battle captives were abused, and we used big bombs in wars. You won't believe how evil we were. That's narrative one. Narrative, and the accompanying corollary is sort of at least an assumption, and no one else ever did these things. That's a big part of this. So like Nicole Hannah-Jones in the 1619 Project just openly says, like, the USA had a system of slavery that was unlike anything the world had ever seen before. Enslaved people were chattel, is the term she uses. They could be bought and sold at will. They were deprived of all their freedom. They could be sexually abused. They were often captured after bloody wars. I mean, just, and she then doesn't mention any other slave systems ever, and just goes on and says this is our original sin and moves to the next essay. So that's point one. Point two is, and we don't talk about this enough. You hear this all the time from these guys. Like, we need to have an honest conversation about race. We need to have an honest conversation about social class. In this country, it's just so hard to talk, frankly, about, fill in the blank, poverty, feminism. We never talk about these things. So the idea is that if you are reading, like, a commie's history of America or whatever, you are part of a select elite. Like, very few people know the things that you know. You are one of the anointed, as the great Tom Sowell once put it, who is aware that the founding fathers were a bunch of drunken, mendacious rapists, and thus you should lead society. And what I say in, Lies Your Liberal Teacher Told You is, one, no, if you look objectively at history, the West was not a uniquely bad society. In fact, we weren't a bad society at all. In fact, once you abandon a framework like Christianity, I'm not even sure what a bad society would mean. Like, humans are predatory
Well, that's
apes.
just it.
So
That's what I've said to you over the years, is that everything you
well, I'm,
see here is a mutation of a Christian aesthetic to have any
there's
basis.
actually a very easy response that I've given back, which is there are many other ethical systems like Stoicism, and one,
No,
and two, you can
no,
also just adopt
no.
a framework.
No, I'm
What?
not. What all I'm saying is the left, all these critiques on America are
Yeah.
presuming a Christian worldview to
Yes.
make these critiques. That's what I'm saying. You know.
Oh, no, no, yeah,
Yeah.
I was just giving kind of like a witty response. Like, yeah, of course,
Yeah.
you're gonna just adopt like the way of the warrior instead. But like fucking purple-haired, they don't adopt that either.
Yeah.
So yes, like their belief system is kind of assuming Christian. That's actually a really good point. The belief system of most social justice warriors is assuming Christian priors without the Christianity.
Right.
In fact, the other great virtue system in the world, they hate. I mean, like, when Nietzsche criticized even Christianity as sort of slave morality, his argument was that the other moral system consists of basically developing yourself to be as good and competitive as possible to enter fair competition. Like, you feel very little empathy. Your goal is to perform for yourself, your wife, and kids, and to expect everyone else to perform. And there's occasional charity, but that is how you help others. And you allow very few limitations on your freedom, and you expect very little mercy from others. That would be considered much worse by the average SJW than what Christians offer. But so, without accepting a moral framework, which postmodernists by definition don't, I'm not sure what it means to say that the West was bad. Like, the cannibals we were fighting in Papua New Guinea were a
Right.
lot worse. No. But anyway, like, even setting the interesting
And
theological
they
discussion,
have no moral judgment about one Indian tribe attacking another Indian tribe.
that's correct.
That's
Yeah, it's
completely outside of consideration of any moral reflection. It's like, you
it,
know,
it's
it's
weird.
almost it's all they treat it the same way as if a hyena is attacking a lion. It's like just nature. You know what I mean? It's such a
Yeah, these are
ethnocentric a
insightful
framework.
points. Yeah, I didn't really think about why this is. I'm more of a quant, so I just sort of noted the phenomenon. But so, like, yeah,
I'm a
so
why guy. That's what all I do. I don't get the facts like you do all the way right. You know, I mean, I
no,
don't drill into the facts as detailed as you do, but that's my thing is why
it's
stuff.
interesting, man. Like, so yes, like there are a couple of things there. Like, one, it is at very least harder to establish what a good society is if you don't have the traditional Western moral frame that includes the idea of good. Now, you can do it. I mean, you can be brutally practical and take something like the UN Human Development Index and use sort of a stoic guideline of the good is
Where did
what
that come
works. And you
from?
can, well, I mean, it comes from the fact that there are things that all humans want that produce optimal outcomes for humans. It doesn't have anything to do with the Christian idea of good. Like, you want water. So there are some societies that turn out to be better at producing water, and those societies have things like rights for women. I mean, so there again, there's a very defensible structure to all of this kind of thing. But the point though is that primitive societies also tend to be worse against that framework. In fact, the serious argument would probably be, if you're coming from a sort of amoralist perspective, that if you don't believe in God, moral rules probably exist because they work. I mean, so like that, I mean, that is actually my opinion on a lot of things. Like, so I don't break my word in general. Like, I don't need lengthy legal contracts when I do business. And partly that's because I think, like an honorable warrior doesn't. But it's also because I thought about it for a day once and it was just like, well, if I did, everything would become infinitely more complicated. Like people wouldn't automatically trust me. I'd
Well,
have to pay for look.
that's where these concepts of sin come from. Missing the mark is about like the chaos that it creates in your life. It's not like random fairy tale right or wrong
Well, yeah,
impositions,
but
you know?
that's the
Yeah.
major counterpoint to the religious argument. Like you
Yeah.
don't need to make up deistic beings to have these ideas. You could just sit your kid down and say, well, if you keep, and not that all the deistic beings are
Yeah.
made up, but like
But
if you
that's
sit
but
your kid
but
down and
that's what I'm trying to say is that that you're taking a very enlightenment derived view of what religion is when you boil it down to metaphysical claims, and I'm saying it's more like what Durkheim would say, which is that religion is a social structure that binds people together. Religion is the same thing as culture at its root. And so
well, in that case,
religio
then
means
we're
to
not.
bind together. So what binds you? What is the binding narrative that glues your sense of transcendent unity with your neighbor together? That's what religio is. And so that's what I'm saying is that they don't have to have metaphysical claims to be imitating the religious ideas that they've inherited in their society.
Yeah, so I mean, just to kind of going back to some of that, I mean, I think that the issue with the really broad kind of Durkheim definition of religion is that it would include almost anything, if you mean sort of synthesis culture.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, like by that standard, Stoicism or Bushido would be a religion. The old American creed, where everyone could recite probably two-thirds of the Constitution, would be an example of religious faith. And I don't really think that's what people mean. Now, I think most people would agree that a society can't really function, at least optimally, unless maybe 70% of people believe in some shared belief system. But I think all social scientists would agree with that. But I think we'd also say that that's pretty different from the idea that everyone has to believe in Shiva or something like that. Boom, we're down to one of me. All right, but I mean, but I think your point there was really good, though. Is like, I mean, this is a fascinating discussion. We always have interesting conversations, but the point that's interesting when it comes to like modern woke people is that they continually morally criticize. Like they'll constantly call you a racist, a pervert, pedophile if you want to have a normal marriage with anyone who's under 40, like all that stuff from Twitter, but they don't have a basis to do so from, really. Like they're almost never traditional Christians. They're very rarely, they're not Stoics. They don't really have any baseline for the argument. I think that's point one. And point two is that they never criticize anyone else. And that's I think, but now we're kind of totally redirected. That was one of the points of the book, that the arguments that are used are never used against anyone but Westerners. So like the argument that conquest is bad is never used against the Mongols, for example. Like Mongolia and China exist today as successful countries. It's never used against the Arabs, who are probably pound for pound the richest people in the world. If you look at the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, countries that exist today, there's never a claim made for example, reparations against the direct lineal descendants of the great Arab slave traders or the West African ones. I mean, Nigeria is a G30 economy. No one's coming after the great grandchildren of Tipu Tip, although those would be scattered around the continent. So it's an interesting phenomenon. But like the theme of the book, kind of last sentence here, but is the idea that the West is uniquely bad is wrong. If anything, Western culture is uniquely good by our standards or most other organized sets of standards. And two, and I think this one's important as well, it's not some radical claim that the West is bad. You're not saying anything new or original. This has actually been the mainstream claim in the North, at least, since like 1945. Well, 48. You had to wait a couple years after World War II. But like I went through a bunch of high school textbooks for this book, and this has been said for a long time. Like debates about how to treat social phenomena, like the famous commentary article, My Negro Problem. which talked about like sort of naive views on integration and the kind of racial fist fighting we still see today and so on. That came out, I think, like 1967. So the idea that outside the Deep South, there was explicit segregation and instruction about how wonderful America was, that this was going on in Chicago or New York, that's kind of partially false. People have just been learning it without it ever being the case for decades. And I kind of wanted to make that point.
Mhm. So what did they say in those early textbooks? That what was the earliest American textbook you looked at in this project?
Well, I mean, I went back into textbooks that went back into the 40s and 50s, and those were a lot more jingoistic. I mean, to be honest, like, I mean, there were some outliers in the northern schools, but I mean, there was a lot of like cowboys popping the six guns kind of stuff at that point. But I mean, they're also so one of the chapters in the book, chapter 2, looks at the idea that the Cold War was kind of an American panic about nothing. And
Yeah,
the
you
point I
say
make
the
is
in your book outline, you say the Red Scare was a moral panic that caught no commies. That's the dogma that we're taught.
that, yeah, that's the dogma, that's the lie. And what I say is that that's actually not true at all. So, I mean, in the field of political science, like a lot of other youngish political scientists, I've looked at. Do you know what the Venona cables are?
No.
Okay. The Venona cables, for anyone in the audience listening to this, it's Venona cables, are worth looking up. Venona cables. In the 1990s, when we were on a friendly kind of basis with Russia, these are the early Putin years. This is after the collapse of the old USSR. We were able to decrypt and obtain a great amount of that whole data set of communications between the old Soviet Union and their spies in the USA.
Mhm.
And to a significant extent, we know who the Russian spies were during the 1950s and 60s. Like it wasn't just an illusion that the USA and the USSR were spying on each other. This is the era that they show in James Bond movies, right? Like this is the spy game.
Right.
And we were doing this shit too. Like we tried to kill Fidel Castro with an exploding cigar. You know, it would have been fun to be a spy in this era, in all honesty. I mean, like another time we thought Latin American men were famously macho, about their muscles and hair. So we
Yeah.
gave him this pomade to try to make his beard fall out. But the Ruskies were doing this stuff too. And the point is that we have a list of all of the Russian agents that were active in the country at this time. You can go on Wikipedia or Britannica and see it. And almost everyone that became kind of a cause celeb for being quote unquote falsely accused of being a Russian agent, Alger Hiss and so on down the line, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, so on down the line. All these people actually were Russian operatives. And the same kind of thing applies to a lot of the content that we were getting in the schools, that we were getting in the popular media to some extent, even then. So the book includes documents from things like the UK Fabian Society that talk really explicitly about how to get communist messages into Western media. And I would say that the first attempts to kind of migrate the idea of global revolution into Western school curricula began in the 50s, 40s, a little before. But I mean, the 1960s, obviously, the time of Western cultural revolution was when a lot of that really took off. And since then, that's been one of the most influential paradigms in the American Academy and in American journalism. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
There's an article, and again, I'm a lengthy talker, so like last thing I was shut up, but like there's an article called "The Prevalence of Marxism in Academia." It dropped on the data resource website Econ Live in 2015, and I cite it pretty often. The data is a little older than that, not much older. But within the social sciences, according to a pretty large study, 18% of professors today are communists. Like they identify as Marxist or communists. To put that in context, about half of 1% of all Americans are communists. Another 21% of professors are activists, like they see themselves not just as scholars, but as radical activists. And another 24% just identify as radicals. And those are asked as separate questions. So if you add them together, it's 45 plus 18, it's 63% of the people on faculties, at least in the social sciences and I think the humanities. So again, I guess the point is just that a huge amount of what you're getting is and has been for a long time. I mean, this article is now 10 years old. and they're polling people who've been in positions of power for 10 or 15 years, is coming from this one particular place of we are bad, and my job is to tell you we are bad. And that's really weird.
Here's your second dogma. Native Americans were peaceful people who spent all day dancing and making love. Did you get that from Kevin Costner's movie, Dancing with Wolves?
Yeah, I just thought that one was funny. That's my favorite chapter title, probably. But yeah, like, I mean, so I'm actually going to read you one of the. This is the U.S. government's Native Americans curriculum. This originally came from the Department of Agriculture, I believe. So let's see. Okay, so there are two parts of this. So I mean, this is me reading from the book. This is page 48. And let me get the actual title of this curriculum. This is the U.S. government's official Native American contribution series of lessons. Okay, so page 48. While people of today have just begun to think about this, indigenous Americans always had a profound love and respect for the natural world. Now, this is all direct quotes. There was a love of every form of life. The Native Americans did not kill anything they could not use. They never killed an animal or a fish for the sport of it. Higher forms of ecology were apparently also practiced. Across all or almost all tribes, Native Americans lived in harmony with nature and did not abuse the natural world. Native Americans were ecologists long before the word was ever used. Okay, now not all this is in direct quotes, but Native American contributions proceeds fairly smoothly on from there to the outline of a supposed shared Amerindian value system, which is argued to have existed fairly universally in the Western Hemisphere prior to 1492. Some of the more notable components of this alleged epistemology are: one, respect for fellow man, no prejudice, in quotes, no major wars, no Indian nation destroyed another. There were thousands of years of peace before 1492. No poor and no rich. No jails, taxes, borders, or boundaries limiting the migration or even potential of peoples in any way. And I mean, it goes on like that for about 40 pages total. I mean, it's just complete bullshit. So I talk in the chapter about actual Native American life. Like, I talk about some of the great, more peaceful tribes, but I talk about the Aztecs, the Iroquois, the Comanche. I mean, the natives are some of the greatest warriors in history. And I just describe what war looked like before you had the Geneva Conventions. I mean, if you really won, like if you beat all the other side's warriors or horsemen, I mean, you killed all the men and raped all the women. I mean, it's just that was reality for humans for a very long time. That's also what the Vikings did and the Zulus did. So I contrast the idealized picture we have today of what's okay, which has been the rule for 76 years. I mean, I guess the Geneva Conventions were finalized in 49, with what actually happened throughout American pioneer history and throughout our wars with the Indians.
Yeah. So you are not impressed with the whitewashing of history. And why do you think that they did that?
Well, interestingly enough, whitewashing, brown washing or red washing or something might be an even better term. Like, the idea is that, so there are 2 points here. One, very quickly, like, the idea in almost every case is that white people or Europeans, capitalists, whatever term you prefer to use, were uniquely evil. I think the reason that this is done is because it's necessary in order to justify a specific kind of quasi-revolutionary agenda.
Mm-hmm.
My boy James Lindsay has a line he repeats all the time, which is like, the issue is never the little issue today, nuclear power versus solar versus coal. The issue is always the revolution. So the pitch that you'll hear from a radical activist on the other side of the debaters table will be something like, we need solar power as part of a general campaign that will include a revised view of women in the workplace and a new attitude toward taxation and so on, so on, so on. And very often, my response will sort of be, either thinking or out loud, why don't we just build nuclear power plants and go on with society the way it is? And if you ask this off the record, it's literally like the famous meme from Facebook where the guy's screaming, I don't want nuclear power plants. I don't want society to go on the way it is. I want to tear down everything.
Yeah.
Like, that's very often the idea. And I mean, like, I'm kidding a little bit, but I think The reason it's necessary to paint the West as uniquely bad, or to paint Western history as the product almost entirely of destruction and desolation, is that that makes it easier to justify destroying contemporary Western society. Like, and I mean, it sounds kind of glib to say that. And I don't think the average Union Democrat who's like a pipe fitter in Akron really wants to do that. He just wants better dental care. But I mean, when you actually look at how this operates in practice, it happens all the time. And it's a pretty mainstream strategy, at least for the Democratic Party in the USA and for the different Green parties in Europe. So, like, an example would be our position one: America's wealth comes from slavery. And that's used to justify position two: so we need reparations for slavery today. Nina Turner, someone I debate with almost in a friendly fashion on Twitter, said this today verbatim. Now, the problem with this, and the reason I think you need books like mine from the right and the center right as a corrective, is that America's historical wealth doesn't come from slavery. I mean, the USA had slaves, not the brutalized British colony that became America during a war that killed, 10,000 of our men after inventive tortures, but the USA. USA only existed from 1776 to 1865. Or, I mean, the USA only existed from 1776 on. We only had slavery from 1776 to 1865. So, I mean, we had a total of, 89 years of slavery. I mean, the country's existed for, we're about 250 years. And throughout most of that period, the South, where the slaves were concentrated, was actually the poorest region of the country. I've read a few serious estimates of how much slavery contributed to U.S. national wealth, and they're generally around like 6 to 20%, maybe 10% would be a good estimate, which is pretty proportional to the black population of the country at the time. Britain did a good one recently that you can find in The Economist. What was the slave contribution to the British Empire? They're obviously a little less African descent in population. It was 3%. So I don't want to get off on this as just a tangent, but when people look and they come up with crazy estimates, anything beyond that, what they're normally doing is counting the value of slave made goods just over and over again on some childlike ish. I mean, so it would be, the idea would be, well, cotton was produced in the South, and the value of raw cotton was 4% of the American economic base, along with timbering and fishing and whaling and so on, beavering and all that stuff. But okay, then what was the percentage of the American economic base that came from clean combed cotton? Okay, and then at that time we were still taking cotton and making it into dresses here in the homeland, right? What percentage of the American economic base would that be? So you're just taking everything that would be added to any goods that were originally made by slaves by any skilled craftsman over all time and attributing that to slavery. If you just look at the legitimate value add of slavery, that's not real. That's why the South was poor. In fact, the usual argument for why the South lost the Civil War is that it was a poorer region with fewer men than the North. So, but I mean, the whole point is, if you accept A, you have to accept B, so we have to pay reparations now.
Yeah. So you think it's all fueled this mythological scapegoating of historical realities is all designed to justify their attempt to annihilate the West as it is today.
Yeah, I mean that's dramatically.
Why do they want to annihilate the West? I think a lot of this has to do, and I talk on the nutrition side of this show a lot. We used to have the late great Dr. Ray Peat, and he talked a lot about the epidemic of underreported low thyroid. And people who have low thyroid are depressed, and typically they're cortisol, adrenaline dominant, stress dominant. They've got a lot of endotoxin that causes them to have basically a mental illness most of their life, undiagnosed, with all this other stuff that they take drugs and things to mitigate it. But what's really going on is people are low thyroid people. They're very stressed out, and they want to annihilate the world because they're very unhappy. Their outlook is very angry and self-destructive. And another way to look at it is this is a societal version of what Jesus encountered with the guy who was possessed in the story of the demon known as Legion, where he was self-stoning, right? He was walking around in the amongst the grave sites, and he had a stone and he was just cutting himself and screaming and wailing, and everybody was like, yeah, don't mess with that guy, that guy's crazy. And that guy got right up in the face of Jesus as soon as he showed up in that town of the Gerasenes. And he said, who are you? And he said, I am Legion. And Legion was the name of the military unit of the Roman Empire that had won the world, had conquered the world. And my point in saying that is, I think there comes a time when you become so possessed by, and you may not like the word empire. I don't know where you stand on that. I don't want to go down all these, rabbit trails, but I think there comes a time when a country becomes so powerful and so bloated and so decadent, like an empire, that it creates this kind of legion demoniac possession in which you're self-flagellating in order to gain status and power.
Well,
I
yeah, I
don't
mean,
think
so I've heard.
they don't really want to destroy the West. They're brats in some sense, and they want to scream and pout because Daddy did not give them enough lollipops, or maybe they gave them too many lollipops, and they're very guilt riddled by how pampered their life has been.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I think these are all terms for the same thing. Like, I mean, when people in the past talk about demons and they talk about using long rituals with the best religious divines in their country, or they talk about using health purgatives, or they talk about
Yeah.
even going to war, they talk about doing these things to rid themselves of the demonic urge to do whatever. I'm not inclined to mock that at all. I don't, I don't, I don't think and certainly don't know that these people were actually inhabited by like astral beings from another world. But I think that the term we use for this today is just our various kinds of mental illness. I mean, and like there actually are a bunch of people that have like looked at this seriously. Like, have you ever heard of ergotism?
What's that?
It's actually fucking fascinating. Ergotism it was like the Viking version of being possessed by demons. Like every so often up in the Viking lands, people just go crazy. Like this is probably where the berserker thing came from. Guys would go nuts. They would, quote, have the strength of five men. They would have these great conversations with the old gods. They would actually very often turn to the white Christ, the new god. But they would also do shit like try to hunt bears naked. And it was just this thing that would happen sometimes. Every so often during like a bad, wet winter, you'd have a lot of guys go crazy. And years later, people found out that during a bad, wet winter, and this took until like World War II when soldiers started doing it, people found out that during a bad, wet winter, this fungus called ergot, which is where LSD apparently comes
Okay,
from,
yeah,
sprouts on bread. So
yeah,
all these guys would be taking these insane trips without knowing why, and they'd be behaving in this bizarre fashion. And, maybe they were talking to God.
yeah,
So they started scraping the bread and the ergotism stopped.
yeah,
And I think that stuff like that, like there
yeah.
actually were these deep spiritual experiences happening. There really would be problems as a Jewish male of military age under the Romans. And those things cause reactions. The where I would defer from many of my religious buddies is that I think that there's an explicable, traceable reaction, or there's an explicable, traceable cause for the thing we're talking about. That doesn't mean it's not spiritual or even not quote unquote magical, actually. It just means that there's something that's happening. So, like, for example, what you're talking about with the thyroid thing. That's actually generally, as I understand, an adjunct of being low T, low testosterone.
Mm-hmm.
So for men, one of the biggest causes of depression is that because of something in your own body or because of an external cause, like you were unable to prevent a tragedy, there's something that happens to your T levels in your body. I recently had a whole conversation about this. I went to get my testosterone checked, like a lot of guys past 35 do. Mine's normal, actually. But they told me if it ever sinks low, you can go put paste on your nuts or whatever. But you can also do things like you can take thyroid, you can take what is it, DHEA or something.
Mm-hmm.
For at least the first couple of years, there are these natural supplements you can take, eat meat that will restore you to normal levels. You take your thyroid, take your DHA, you eat your meat, and you're again back to masculinity. Their
Mm-hmm.
fenugreek seeds and so on are good for this. So I think that what you're saying when you say a lot of guys have low thyroid levels would be a lot of people in our society, which seems kind of meaningless, large, yes, imperial. A lot of men in particular are depressed. They don't feel very male. They don't feel very masculine. They don't feel like they're in relationships and they're not leading in them if they are. There are a lot of problems, and those can take you down some rabbit holes. The crazy new drugs we have. I don't think porn occasionally is a big deal, but a lot of guys are sitting in front of computers watching porn or gaming for hours a day. Like all this shit's going on, and to these constant depressive inputs in negative ways. You can call that demons if you want. I mean, my personal opinion would be that if you got away from the computer and you stopped taking pills or using powders and you went to the gym or the gun range, you would see changes in your life.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I think that when you are in a depressive cycle, you are more inclined to hate yourself, things you identify with yourself, and things you've been taught to hate. So I'm not a psychologist. I'm a political scientist. So I'll just keep this to one sentence. If Americans were happier, yes, I think they would hate the West less. There is a huge amount of declining empire syndrome here, where the people who tend to like the West, I mean, people joke about the guy people on the right being like a little chubby and a little too cocky and so on, but the people on the right tend to, by and large, be normal people. Blue collar job or white collar job like country lawyer, usually in a happy relationship. Whenever I talk to a conservative pundit, Matt Walsh recently, they have like 4 or 5 kids. There's this block. And then there are the people over here that are trying to define what their new gender is. And it's the people in this block that don't like society. And I don't think that's a coincidence. What people mean by a demon is just the decay in the brain caused by doing things that are unhealthy for mankind. Even not eating meat is unhealthy for humans. We're a predator species.
Mhm. Yeah. No, it's true. It's and then a lot of people are estrogen dominant, including women have too much estrogen, and that's been mislabeled and lied about and establishment medical science for years that trying to normalize over too much estrogen in people's bodies, including women, creates a lot of stressful outcomes that create a lot of these effects that people have, where they have a no sense of joy, no sense of wonder. Everything pisses you off 1,000 times more than it should. Holding on to grudges. All these things are largely affected by our environment and our food, our sleep, our blue light exposure. All of these terrible seed oils. I hope, Wilfred, that you've been studying seed oils now, because that's something that I put out there and made kind of help push that into the mainstream. And now you probably get inundated with your seed oil memes, but there's something really powerful behind understanding what they do. But all these things contribute, and I think it's important to have a multidisciplinary approach to let history interact with uh, nutrition and physiology and science and social science interact with psychology, and let them all blend together, and you'll find something really fascinating about the truth of the situation we're in. So I think I always like to approach these things like a detective. Okay, so you identify the agenda as destroying history so that we can justify harming ourselves. Now, okay, well, why are we wanting to harm ourselves, right? And you start asking those questions and start to arrive at the answer. And I think that's really where a lot of these things can be fixed by healing our thyroid and healing our body's health, getting good sleep, and having a sip of orange juice. Orange juice is good for your thyroid as well. I mean, I'm not just saying that because I live in Florida and I have a background in citrus.
Yeah, man. I mean, and one of the things that's kind of funny, like when people hear one of these sort of bro conversations where we're just like, yeah, drink that orange juice. I mean, it's easy to sort of make fun of, but
Yeah,
at a certain level, like there's an obvious common sense point here. Like if you go to the gym or the range and train as a warrior, or you
yeah,
eat the things that humans are supposed to eat,
yeah,
like lean meat, vegetables, you eat some grains occasionally, you drink
yeah,
fresh fruit juices,
yeah,
like you're going to be healthier and happier
yeah.
than you are if you do things humans are not supposed to
Right,
do,
right.
like sit in front of automated devices all day or eat
Yeah,
packaged pounds of sugar. Like that would be a very occasional treat when you found a beehive.
yeah,
So, I mean, like a lot of people are in this weird cycle where you're consuming the most extreme stimuli you can find all day. You don't eat, and I actually think it's a pretty important point because, like, if you ever, I was in the rave scene in the 90s, and people would always take these hyper extreme drugs and then
yeah,
be surprised. And this was never an extreme degree my vice, but like people would be surprised that they couldn't enjoy normal life. Like guys would like take ecstasy and watch the sunrise in front of the Sears Tower, and then be surprised they didn't enjoy their coffee date 2 days later because their brains all fucked up and you don't have any, what is it,
serotonin.
serotonin left. But I mean, like it's the same thing here to a lesser degree. Like if your food consumption, if your bread contains sugar, you're taking in these incredibly intense stimuli every time you eat. You're eating fast food. you're not having sex with your girl 2 or 3 times a week. You're watching people in orgies from distant locations twice a day. You're not it just over and over. Like, you're not sparring with your friends. You're simulating the killing of other human beings 50 times a day.
Yeah.
And again, all of this in moderation. I mean, many people are perfectly fine with, but just go through the whole list. Like, you're not taking a shot once a week. You're using any of the hyper intense powders and proteins we've now created every single time you lift a weight. Like, if every day you're doing this, normal experiences are going to be fairly non-stimulating to you.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that life is composed largely of normal experiences. You can't be stimulated all the time. Your heart would explode. People around you would think you're a crazy junkie. So you're actually going to be depressed and underwhelmed most of the time in the real world. So I think the best way to deal with that is to spend most of your time in the real world, eating real food, talking to real people.
Right.
And there's an occasional treat, but that's it.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. Well, I really appreciate your time, and I want people to check out the upcoming book you've got here. Sounds like an interesting myth busting endeavor. It's called Lies Your Liberal Teacher Told You by Professor Wilfred Reilly. And so, any last thoughts here before we part?
Just very briefly, I think I want to just reiterate that theme of the book, which is that Western culture is not bad, one, but two, more importantly, like, the idea that it's somehow novel to believe that your society is evil, this sort of thing, that's the exact opposite of reality. If you want to be a rebel today, what the most dangerous, rebellious thing you could probably do is be normal. Start a family, read some books from
Yeah.
before 1985, go live a regular life.
Yeah. Well, very good. Thank you for your time, sir. It's always great talking to you.
Thank you, sir. You too. Have a good one.
You too. And if you want to stay in touch with us at A Neighbor's Choice, you can email us hello@aneighborschoice.com or follow me at David Gornoski on X. I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.